Good evening, everyone. We have, excuse us, since we're doing this as a hybrid event, I also have to check with the producers here on the side just to make sure we're getting good sound going out virtually as well as here in the room. So Emily, are we all set? All right, good. Thank you for coming tonight, everyone. Both those of you who are joining us in person, it's a great pleasure to have you here. We're delighted that you managed to brave a very cold Tulsa night. And of course, we're very grateful to those of you who are joining us virtually for this evening's event as well. One of the pleasant discoveries, of course, of this Zoom era is exactly this, our ability to provide programming that's accessible both to those who are here on campus, as well as to those who are joining us, both from here all over Tulsa and of course from all over the world. So we'll go ahead and get started. We're just after 7 o'clock. It looks like we're still letting people into the Zoom room here. So we'll ask you to bear with us as they continue to come in. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself and say a few words about the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities before we begin tonight's program. So for those who don't know me, my name is Sean Latham. I'm the Walter Professor of English here at the University of Tulsa and the director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, the host for this evening's event. As I said before I get going, I just want to say a few words about the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities for those who are unaware of some of the work that we do. We essentially serve a two-part mission. The first of which is to act as a kind of think tank here on campus. And each year we choose, with the help of members of the community and faculty here on campus, a topic or a theme and or idea that we think can only be fully and richly illuminated and addressed using the distinctive tools of the arts and humanities. Throughout this academic year, 2021-2022, we've been perhaps over-optimistically when we started this process, exploring the theme of renewal and recovery. And in addition to that work that we do here on campus, which involves bringing together faculty, students, and members of the community to work together in a kind of intensive think tank environment throughout the course of the year, we also host between 20 and 30 public events each year, including the one this evening. So I'm going to give you just some sense of a few of the events that we also have coming up at the Humanities Center and urge you to mark your calendars for them. So on March 3rd, our next event, we will host Professor Maslach, Christina Maslach from the University of California at Berkeley. This is going to be a program on the idea of burnout and overcoming burnout. Maslach is, for those who are unfamiliar with her work, she's a professor of psychology, as I said, at Berkeley, and she's essentially one of the two people that helped coin the term burnout and helped understand this as a cultural and workplace phenomenon that took shape in the 60s and 70s. So we're very honored that she'll be able to join us for this event and talk to us a little bit about the history of the idea of burnout and about how we treat and process the experience of burnout in our personal lives and in our workplaces. The day after that, actually on Friday, March 4th, we have two events. We'll be hosting, first of all, at 5 o'clock that evening, a group of students and faculty and representatives from the Muskogee Nation who have been working together on a research project that's focused on recovering the lives and stories of the women that first attended the precursor to the University of Tulsa, the Presbyterian School for Girls. So this group has been working together in archives, especially here at the university, of course, but around Oklahoma to see what we can recover about the lives of those girls when this was just a girls' school in Muskogee before it moved to Tulsa. So they'll be making an interim report essentially on the research that they've done so far. And that will precede the opening of a new show at the Zero Center at downtown Tulsa in the Arts District. As some of you may know, this is actually a sort of home base for the arts and humanities in downtown that's owned by the university and operated by the University of Tulsa. And we'll be opening a 2-month show that begins that night on the revival of the American bison in the United States. So we'll have artifacts, paintings, drawings, carvings, all kinds of things that sort of trace the history of bison in the Americas from the earliest known artworks that we have featuring bison up through their near extinction in the 19th century to the process that has led to their healthy recovery in the 20th and 21st century, thanks particularly to the work of indigenous tribes who have helped ranch and recover these animals. And then on March 26th, we're hosting a talk and a screening by the filmmaker and multimedia storyteller, Marianne Andre, who's coming down from Nebraska. She created a documentary on the history of the revival of the bison in the United States and also wrote an absolutely fascinating book on the history of taxidermy in the 19th and 20th century United States that's about the ways in which taxidermy helped us understand and sort of think about our relationship to animals in the United States. And I would remind you, as I said earlier, that the Zero Center is in fact open in downtown Tulsa. We're open every day from noon to 5 o'clock, or sorry, not every day. We're open Wednesday through Saturdays from noon to 5 o'clock. You'll always find exhibitions that are on display in the Zero Center, as well as for those of you who are faculty and students at Tulsa, there's places now to sit down there and work and just have a place to relax downtown or to do your work downtown to help us feel a part of the larger Tulsa community. And in May, we'll be using the Zero Center to host the Arts and Humanities Festival. That'll take place in conjunction with Mayfest, where student work of all kinds, creative writers, artists, musicians, filmmakers, will all be on display in the Zero Center. We have many other events that we're hosting throughout these coming months, especially as we do indeed seem to be recovering from the Omicron wave of COVID and beginning to venture out in person for events like the one we're hosting tonight. So I urge you to visit our website at humanities.utulsa.edu. Follow us on Facebook, on Instagram, or Twitter, where you'll find regular updates about our events. So one of the great pleasures for any of us who work as teachers is the opportunity to welcome back, or maybe to welcome home, a former student who has set out to do great good in the world. And so I'm delighted tonight to welcome Professor Althea Tait back to the University of Tulsa for tonight's event. After receiving her BA from Oral Roberts University here in Tulsa, Professor Tait attended the English MA program from 2001 to 2003, arriving in fact just a few years after I did. And after attending the University of Maryland, she then went on to receive her PhD in English from Morgan State University, and she's now an associate professor of African American literature at SUNY Brockport. It would be enough, perhaps, to say that she's an expert on the work of Toni Morrison. And we'll have the privilege tonight of hearing how one of the nation's greatest writers weaves an ecological sensibility through her fiction. But Professor Tait's work stretches far beyond this. She's the editor, most recently, of I Die Daily, Black Bodies, Police Brutality, and the Force of Children's Literature, with the University Press of Mississippi, which explores the ways young adult literature has valiantly responded to trauma over the span of the last 50 years. Her other publications include Empathy, The Probing Problem We All Live With, and Sound is the DNA, teaching anthems of the Harlem Renaissance in hip hop. This, however, still doesn't do justice to the breadth of Professor Tait's interests. Her creativity and her ability to find unexpected connections of the kind she'll explore tonight has been everywhere evident in her work and in my own experience with her as a teacher and a colleague. In the lead up to this talk, in fact, it has been a great pleasure to talk with her about everything from Victory Gardens and their history in the United States to astronomy and Alice Waters, the great chef from San Francisco. The Oklahoma Center for Humanities is fortunate to have her with us this evening, and so I hope you'll join me in welcoming a proud TU alum back to campus. So, Professor Tait.
I paid him to say all those wonderful things. Thank you for coming out tonight in this very crisp, cold evening. I really appreciate that. This is a day before Toni Morrison's birthday. She would have been 92 years old tomorrow. We lost her August 5th, 2019. And I hope to elucidate and illuminate some of my findings in her work in the ways that reconnect us with the earth and with nature, this pivotal moment. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Oklahoma Center for Humanities, its director, Professor Sean Latham, who we just heard from, and this invitation to speak to the theme of recovery and renewal in such a critical hour in our nation. And thinking of what we're dealing with COVID-19, the various spaces of a lack of peace in the world right now, and we can go on and on. I also want to thank the departments of English, History, women's and gender studies, and their students, some of who I see in the audience right now, who have been supportive of my ongoing research during this time. I am grateful to return to a space of learning that helped to shape my ability to wait for and to listen to the narratives, especially the quiet ones, lending a sovereign demand to be told, which we cannot ignore. The heart, anything dead coming back to life hurts. This we cannot ignore. This profound claim is spoken by a white indentured teenage girl. While she is tending to the open back of a slave girl named Setha, running for her life, even with life within her. She's pregnant, and yet she stretches towards Ohio, the site of the triphthongal sublime dejection based on the hybrid split of the freed sector from the permitted enslaved sector of the state. She and the child she carries defies the odds of the grotesque beating, the sexual violation she endured before leaving the fictionalized Sweet Home plantation. Their joy is short-lived because school teacher, the overseer, and the patrollers discover Setha, her children, and her mother-in-law, baby Suggs. Her response? To take the children's lives. At least one and attempt the others. Her logos? To protect them from the brutal enslavement she endured. The fictional beloved in Setha mirrors the 1856 living narrative of Margaret Garner, whose tragic experiences the novel represents. During Garner's trial, the 19th century abolitionist Lucy Stone reiterates part of the context around Garner's choices and motives for what others deemed insanity. Quote, "The faded faces of the Negro children tell too plainly to what degradation the female slaves submit. Rather than give her daughter to that life, she killed it. If in her deep maternal love, she felt the impulse to send her child back to God, to save it from the coming woe, who shall say she had no right to do so?" End quote. Merciful murder was a choice. An ingredient is a choice. Imagine with me, if you will, 166 years later, spice gripping brown fingers close to the hue of tobacco, after it's been stored away, like the last bit of salt meat for one of the ancestors who knew such a delicacy may come yearly. The words etched into the bottom of the spice bottle catches one's notice. Chesapeake. Chesapeake is the meeting point for tears. 100,000 streams, rivers, the fresh water, that is, ache into the bay and meet the salt of the Atlantic Ocean pouring in. Amani Perry remembers for us a particular watershed moment. She tells of a slave named Henry who was a victim of race-swaddle psychology near the Chesapeake. That drapetomaniacs was the term used of one accused of the psychiatric condition of one who is, quote, prone to run away, end quote, especially if they were enslaved. Yet, Henry could not break this habit. Though of a dissenting nature, he conceded to being the chief enslaved servant for a master. What broke him? I wondered. Not the noose, not the backs breaking cane at daybreak, or the gripping whelp of an other untamed drapetomaniac. No, instead it was salt brine. The very salt licking of a slaver crossing the transatlantic was needed again to pour into the open back of a female slave. When she held mercy, mouth dropped open and all, he wept. Another chance meeting. An ingredient is a choice. What I'm about to share with you is a reimagination of how broken-hearted enslaved men and women and children have survived hurts So great, not even 100,000 tributaries of fresh water or the volume of salt pouring in from the Atlantic, who pours half of itself into the Chesapeake, or that strange estuary marriage where the fresh and the salt water consummate as if foreshadowing the enslaved woman's tears, spilling in rhythm with the brine into the back. I wondered, was her back ever defiant in tenderness, with a sudden bite that betrayed fear of the slave bit? Could she have posed for Clint, being the envy of it all because some part of her knew the concave of desire, like the sweep of camel hair swifting crimson into focus? Not one drop could keep the brokenhearted away from life. And you will learn that I am like the super Luddite. I know how to turn computers on. And as you can see, I'm struggling to get my arrows to work. Why is it working for you? Okay.
Just use the arrow.
Is it supposed to do that? Let's try again. I wonder with you, what compelled broken ones to choose life when misery seemed to prevail, when existence was most appealing? What caused the heart to leap within? Was it a green shoot? Shoot, what do we know? What we do know is that if life prevailed again, it did so with a broken heart. While this talk is focused on a specific culture group and author, I want to provide moments where we understand with the heart that the specific is always tied to the universal experience. Aha, with the caveat of knowing there can never be commensurate experiences. And there's always danger to conflating narratives. I want to invite you, even those of you who are with us in the Zoom audience, to have paper and pencil and pen. This is a collaborative effort as we work through this narrative tonight. I want to invite you to take 3 minutes to pause and reflect on a time when great or mild suffering impacted your lives, and by chance or purpose, you connected with the soil, with the earth. And did this activity soothe a sore place? Did it distract you, if for but a moment in time? And I think, if I'm not correct, there is paper and pencil that was at the front door, but I'm going to give you literally 3 minutes to do so. I'm not going to time you, but you can do so on your phones. Those of you who are techies. But I'd like to ask you, even those of you who are in the Zoom audience, to take 3 minutes to pause and reflect with me on a time when great or mild suffering impacted your lives, and by chance or purpose, you connected with the soil. And if you're wondering why I'm appropriating this type of methodology, it is because I take great liberty when we discuss lives and bodies that have been broken. So I break from traditional methodology often in my research and scholarship, and my pedagogy as well. Sure. Reflect on a time when great or mild suffering impacted your lives, and by chance or purpose, you connected with the soil, with the earth. Did this activity soothe that sore place? Did it distract you, even if for but a moment? This, by the way, is a creek in Alabama, and there's that connection with the author, as Toni Morrison's grandparents were from Greenville, Alabama. Just thinking of places that slaves and former slaves would have literally trekked through this space geographically. We have about 1 more minute. Now, I return to this brokenness we cannot escape, a palimpsest of sorts. The palimpsest can best be described as text layered over time. In his 1845 essay titled The Palimpsest, Thomas de Quincey metaphorically shapes a psychological palimpsest, arguing, quote, "What else than a natural and mighty palimpsest is the human brain? Everlasting layers of ideas, images, and feelings have fallen upon your brain softly as light. Each succession has seemed to bury all that went before. And yet in reality, not one has been extinguished. They are not dead, but sleeping. There is none of passion or disease that can scorch away these immortal impulses. Yet, I would contend the heart of the enslaved and former slaves and their descendants reveal the scorching can lead to recovery with time, with intentional restoration. Tulsa is evident of such possibilities, though more unified work is required, which I'll talk to that point more at the end of this. Using moments of history, Morrison's fictional and non-fictional meditations on history, and our understanding or even our lack of understanding of history, I wish for us to consider the past and present moments as spaces in time where we would do well to foster recovery and renewal, and defiantly so. My methodology is simple. It follows in the tradition of Black literary scholarship, particularly Richard Wright's framing of the complex simplicity. He writes, quote, "The life of the Negro people," of course, that would be changed today to Black people as we consider it more of a diaspora, "is not simple. The presentations of their lives should be simple, yes, but all the complexity, the strangeness, the magic wonder of life that plays like a bright sheen over the most sordid existence should be there," end quote. And the sordid existence, obviously, with him coming out of Mississippi, he's referencing the racialized and class oppression and many other layers. In this turn of the narrative, I wish to recall the complex simplicity of the etymology of the heart. In the Latin, the word heart translates to core, and in the Greek as cardia. Both terms have in common the rhetoric of the word middle. Middle, as in the darkened center of a black-eyed pea, the pea that signaled peace for the heart of Black folks. Black-eyed peas became a staple for New Year's Eve celebrations for former slaves because, as John Martin Taylor explores, the peas were associated with luck. The discussion of peas, reprieves from the horror of slavery, luck, and sustenance aside, I return to the core, the cardia. Sometimes in order to recover, you must return to the site of injury, especially when we are naming collective hurt that is palimpsestic in nature. James Baldwin opens The Price of the Ticket with Clara Ward's powerful lyrics. My soul looks back and wonders how I got over. Indeed. Baldwin asserts the Middle Passage is a palimpsest, for, quote, one can neither assess nor overcome the storm of the Middle Passage, where, quote, one is mysteriously shipwrecked forever, end quote. This positionality deserves further investigation, especially when considering the origin of trauma and lasting hurt that Morrison explores in her work, particularly in relationship to how do we heal this? Because the palimpsest is layered, the narrative defies a linear telling. I would wish deeply if I could just go as streamlined chronologically, but the narrative does not allow for that. This narrative is as shapely as the heart and its ventricles. And many scholars have sculpted their interpretations of this narrative in various disciplines, right? We can go from visual studies to history, to literature, sociology, statistics, critical race theory, et cetera, et cetera. I now turn to Thomas Filling's visual study of the Middle Passage. As a storyteller, he produces a work that was 20 years in the making within the Middle Passage. And this was literally a text. Fillings is just a well-renowned painter and illustrator for children's and adults, Black literature, et cetera. And his agent kept coming to him and saying, we have a contract on this book. When is the book done? And it literally took him 20 years. And so I'm going to show you just portions of the images that I want to show from the text. And I do want to say that they are painful, but they do get us to the point of where we're going, what we're mapping tonight, okay? The work is a visual depiction of the most influential site of Black suffering in the remains, and that of a slave ship. Filling's most poignant image related to the study appears toward the end of the collection. One gazes upon the image of a male slave lying face up. Filling's approach is a restorative act that requires the viewer to witness a slave who is presumably a corpse. There is no visibility of his eyes. Instead, readers are given a distinct view of his throat, as if the image itself is the sufferer's voice. V to V, the pointed end of his clavicle meets the nose of a slave ship dwelling within him. The reader's gaze views the ship from a hollowed out perspective, as if one is part of a surgical audience, collectively witnessing the slave's humanity, hollowed out by suffering under Filling's rendering of a story in a refused clinical approach. There are the kidneys, the liver, and the bowels, refuting the critic's mishandling of the narrative. Yes, it is grievous, and yet evokes comfort. Finally, someone has revealed this terror within. In chorus with Filling's narrative, layering of meaning, the image also provides deeper nuances of the slave ship. The ship within depicts hundreds of slaves lying on one next to the other. In spite of the recorded descriptions, especially of the famed Brooke ships, of slaves being piled upon one another. So I'm going to fast forward a bit. And so this is the description of the Brooke ship that's pretty famous when you're studying transatlantic studies of the Middle Passage. And you literally see this very organized taxonomical framing of the slaves' bodies, which we know was not accurate. This is just a diagramming of sorts, an illustration ethnographically of what's going on ships. We know that they were piled together like sardines, many of them preferring to even jump off aboard to suicide rather than being down in the holds. But I want to return back to Filling's description here. Fillings is an artist who meticulously researched the body of evidence related to the Middle Passage for decades. And he places the slaves side by side. Their bodies are drawn in a scaled fashion that defies the traditional images of slaves stacked upon another. In Filling's rendering, there is space to breathe. And we know that that rhetoric has been going forth in America in relationship to the sanctity of every human being, especially Black people, from 2014 with Eric Garner to just most recently with George Floyd, right? And so with this scaling that Fillings gives us, right, there's space to breathe, a structured proximity for the suffering, a visual manipulation and revision to the suffering to some degree that slaves experience in the inhumane conditions, right?
Added to feelings creation is the possibility of loincloths is one way to read this. As you can see, this sort of missing space here. Or we can read this artistically in the way of negative space, right? When artists are taking away something to draw your attention to that space that they are giving the negative space. With blank space, each image of a victim's body is split in half in the center. This goes back to the very core. Their navels are missing, which I think feelings is drawing our attention to the very fact that the word ship etymologically literally ties to the word nave, where we also get the framing for navel. As one gazes at the image, one may ask, is feelings drawing a correlation between the chain-bound slaves who are navalists and the ship, which has its roots term-wise to nave, or is he doing something else? I know for certain that this image takes us back to Earl Baldwin's assertion that diasporic descendants are shipwrecked forever. However, particularly in this moment in America where we are right now, I think we have to defiantly reimagine the narrative. And so this is where I apply a reading of core and cardia to say specifically perhaps that very part of slaves that was attacked, their core, their heart, it speaks something to even this moment now as we sit here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In Morrison's Beloved, we come to understand the importance of the heart to Black bondspersons and their descendants. And there is a rather lengthy passage, but it's impossible to cut. Usually, right, you want to take excerpts of a passage, but this is one passage in Morrison's oeuvre. You cannot touch it. You cannot reframe it. It comes once again from the novel Beloved, and it refers to Setha's mother-in-law, Baby Suggs. You and I must come to Baby Suggs' clearing. Quote, when warm weather came, Baby Suggs Holy, followed by every Black man, woman, and child who could make it through, took her great heart to the clearing. A wide open space cut deep in the woods. Nobody knew for what at the end of a path known only to deer and whoever cleared the land in the first place. In the heat of every Saturday afternoon, she sat in the clearing while the people waited among the trees. After situating herself on a huge flat-sided rock, Baby Suggs bowed her head and prayed silently. The company watched her from the trees. They knew she was ready when she put her stick down. Then she shouted, "Let the children come." And they rang from the trees toward her. "Let your mothers hear you laugh," she told them, and the woods rang. The adults looked on and could not help smiling. Then, "Let the grown men come," she shouted. They stepped out one by one from among the ringing trees. "Let your wives and your children see you dance," she told them, and ground life shuddered under their feet. Finally, she called the woman to her. "Cry," she told them. "For the living and the dead, just cry." And without covering their eyes, the woman let loose. It started that way, laughing children, dancing men, crying women, and then it got mixed up. Women stopped crying and danced. Men sat down and cried. Children danced. Women laughed. Children cried until exhausted and riven, all and each lay about the clearing, damp and gasping for breath. She began, "Here, and this place here, we flesh. Flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet and grass. Love it. Love it hard. Yonder they do not love your flesh, they despise it. No more do they love the skin on your back, yonder they flay it. And oh, my people, they do not love your hands. Those they only use, tie, bind, chop off and leave empty. Love your hands. Love them. Raise them up and kiss them. Touch others with them. Pat them together. Stroke them on your face because they don't love that either. You got to love it. You. And no, they ain't in love with your mouth. Yonder out there, they will see it broken and break it again. What you say out of it, they will not heed. What you scream from it, they do not hear. What you put in it to nourish your body, they will snatch away and give you leavings instead. No, they don't love your mouth. You got to love it. This is the flesh I'm talking about here. Flesh that needs to be loved, feet that need to rest and to dance, backs that need support, shoulders that need arms, strong arms. I'm telling you. And oh, my people out yonder, hear me. They do not love your neck, unnoosed and straight. So love your neck, put a hand on it, grace it, stroke it, and hold it up. And all your inside parts are just as soon slap for hogs. You got to love them. They'll have dark liver, love it. And the beat and beating heart, love that too. More than eyes or feet, more than lungs that have yet to draw free air. More than your life-holding womb and your life-giving private parts, hear me now. Love your heart, for this is the prize. I told you we would break traditional methodology, and I would ask you to engage with me moment to moment at times. For a few moments, I'd like you to pause and consider moments where you were refused the freedom to dance, to laugh, to cry, or to breathe. Again, these moments do not conflate with what these people endured, and many of the descendants continue to. But I think in this particular moment where we are struggling with COVID-19 and its impact on our world, where nearly 1 million lives have been lost in America, at some point, regardless of your skin color, your religion, your orientation, your socioeconomics, you might remember a moment where you were refused the freedom to dance, to laugh, to cry, or to breathe. I'm going to give you 2 minutes on this one. Another half minute. I hope those of you in the Zoom audience are also taking time to pause and write and reflect. Please forgive me if I don't momentarily come to you. So what does this space have to do with green shoots and survival of Black people, of people in general, recovery, renewal, justice, even victory in dimensions? Everything. And everything about this narrative resists romanticization or totalizing conclusions. It is a continuum that we are in that is triumphant and at times heartbreaking. But we must have courage to rewrite the palimpsest, to relive new layers of this narrative with great imagination for change. This is the impetus, the very impetus behind the migration of Black peoples, a migration of Black people's volition, right? The first great migration across the Atlantic was forced. Black people of parts of the South, however, centuries later, and even free portions of the Union like Ohio, They left the South trekking through soil thick as clay while catching tricklings of the river to soothe the weariness within. Bonnie Lynn Chereau describes this trek, quote, she argues, as slaves of Choctaws, Creeks, and Seminoles, African Americans have been removed to Indian territory, along with the tribes after the Treaty of Equitah in 1835. And John Ridge, one of the Cherokee signers, estimated that in 1826, his nation contained, quote, 13,583 Native citizens and 1,277 African slaves, end quote. Of that relationship between the Indians and their slaves, Ridge goes on to note, there is a scanty instance of African mixture with the Cherokee blood, and that African slaves are mostly held by half-breeds and full Indians of distinguished talents. All right, so we're starting to see this indigenous and Black eugenics in a way that we've seen, right, in the ways of Eurocentric oppression of Blacks. And then Cheryl goes on to argue after the Civil War, quote, the Cherokees and other tribes who had sided with the Confederacy were forced to give up some of their lands and emancipate their slaves. These Indian freedmen founded the first all-Black communities in Oklahoma. All right, we know of Langston, yes. African servicemen moved into the territory, as Lynn Chereau argues, in 1889 as the famous Buffalo Soldiers, and they were sent to suppress Indian attacks on white settlements in the region. So once again, this is a narrative that is always in some ways problematized, right, as we move forward. That's the nature of the continuum. The Paradise Project, as Morrison referred to her writing of the novel Paradise, was based on her findings of all of these all-Black towns founded in the 19th century. And for the author, it provided, quote, a rich field for an exploration into race-specific and yet race-free language. She wanted to transgress and render useless those assumptions, end quote. And this is coming from a lecture she had given on the novel Paradise. Yet when you read the novel, you see that she continues to wrangle with the race language nonetheless. Quote, they shoot the white girl first, end quote. This is the first line of the novel. The novel was spun around the narrative of 8 women and girls whose narratives framed that of the all-Black town Ruby, settled by a patriarch, dark complexion-wise as Ore and known as the 8 Rock. The male descendants enter the woman's space, the convent as it is known, to rid their town of the debauchery the women represent. The debauchery is a deflection of their hearts. They fell to control the woman and their influence upon the town. And so they must engage in what the narrator describes as pure hatred. This description is a stark contrast with Morrison's meditations on Milton when composing the Paradise Project. She meditates on Milton's description of, quote, the goodliest trees, loading with fairest fruit, blossoms and fruits at once of golden hue, with gay enamel colors, mix of native perfumes, of nectar visiting each plant, and fed flowers worthy of paradise. Groves whose rich trees wept odorous gums and balm, others whose fruit burnished with golden rind, luxuriant, end quote. And this is her meditating on excerpts of Milton's Paradise. As they walk through the convent, memories of the descendants of the 8 Rocks, their mothers are evoked, and these mothers illuminate a difficult luxury. And we know from the narratives of those who landed in Oklahoma and Tulsa that migration was necessary, salvific, far from luxury at times. It was the beginning of recovery, a soul renaissance. In Paradise, and this is a quote taken from the moment that describes the migrants, there were many days of trekking with a caravan of 81 people, 50 or so families. Big Papa pressed his hand into the flattened grass. He closed his eyes. Here, he said, this is our place. Well, it wasn't, of course, not yet anyway. It belonged to a family of state Indians, and it took 1 year and 4 months of negotiation of labor for the land to finally have it free and clear. Coming from lush vegetation to extravagant space could have made them feel small when they saw more sky than earth, grass to their hips. Here in the prairie lands, to the old fathers, it signaled luxury. an amplitude of soul and stature that was freedom without borders and without deep menacing woods where enemies could hide. Here, freedom was not entertainment like a carnival or a hoedown that you can count on once a year, nor was it table droppings from the entitled. Here, freedom was a test administered by the natural world that a man had to take for himself every day, end quote. The language of taking portrays the difficult dance Black people had with the land. Morrison's own maternal grandparents, as I noted earlier, fled Greenville, Alabama, after being robbed of their chance to own land as sharecroppers. This trauma led them to migrate to Lorain, Ohio, where industry prevailed over the agricultural pursuit of the American dream. And this is the axis of the novel as it returns to, as it renders an intergenerational conversation between the original settlers of Ruby and the descendants of 1970s. And so the setting of the novel allows us to shift literally from the 19th century to the civil rights movement. And the way that Morrison does it is the way that Morrison does it. It is magic. You don't question it. I want to shift to the civil rights movement at this point, as it is key to the novel's plot. Using this chronological framing, I want to place Morrison now in conversation with a white female culinary influencer and activist, Alice Waters, right, who we know came out of the Berkeley area during the uprisings against the Vietnam War and the racial oppression and the gender oppression at that time, that space of a zeitgeist in our world. What do the Waverly songs of Alice Waters, ear swishing breath from the larynx with her litany of what hunger, right? When you listen to her talk, there's something mystical almost about her voice as she's describing the issue of food insecurity in our nation. She's like, what hunger? Why do we have hunger, right? And what does that have to do with the sound of Toni Morrison's enunciation of a choir's chorus of suffering 4 centuries old? Waters and Morrison hold the tongue as kale and fat back are placed on the palate's ridges of expectations. And when I hear Alice Waters describe the deprivation of taste we now experience because of the wasteland of soil that has replaced soil proficient and micronutrients required to yield a tomato that tastes like a tomato, or an onion that layers the yawn of tears and blinking labor into a stew, or shall I say a yam that smatters like the call for sustenance from the Black peddler that awakened Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man from his induced state of amnesia in Harlem. Images are held for me. The images of Black slaves bowing to pinch the earth like snuff, not just the earth they had not plowed, as if it was chased snow to the side of the path that one dares to reach for, to clump solid, to lift, to taste as if to only know what heaven tastes like when it is undecided, ice or water. These slaves reach for soil instead, soil so reliable to build with, they named it clay, clay so fulfilling, their mistresses named their stooping and pinching as addiction, dared them be caught lest they be placed in the bit. Why would a bite of soil be forbidden? Soil clay for slaves in tattered clothing and bare feet. The earth nurtured them when men failed. This is the soil Waters lobbies for, noting, quote, bad soil produces bad food, end quote. And I'm just gonna pause very, very, very briefly. There was a habit of slaves to literally eat soil. And we can trace this in mistresses' diaries where literally they thought it was an addiction, which we now know their diets were so badly provided for in the way of nutrition. They were literally just achingly drawn to the soil, like you and I are for orange juice or something with vitamin C when our bodies are fighting off something. Waters brings us into a clearing space as if she were a cultural mulatto in sorts, in the way that Trey Ellis defines. And this is a definition of where he says some Black people may be deemed a cultural mulatto, meaning that they have influences of both Black and white culture. And so I'm using this to reframe Alice Waters as a white woman, right, who plates in her restaurant start at $395. I looked. and there in Berkeley, and what she's able to do in this sort of parallel way of Black cultures of old. Waters is Morrison's baby Suggs, a prophet of food sustainability. She is responsible for over 6,000 schools partnering with local farmers to feed their local communities. Children are fed, families are fed. Like Suggs the Beloved, who feeds the neighborhood with a feast, Waters brings Americans into a clearing space to rid them of crouching poverty and the devastation of hunger. She is more heroic, though, than radical. Radical hunger is to know the nuances of hunger within the belly and within the soul. And like Waters, Morrison did not individually experience hunger. As a Black thespian, however, she traveled with the Howard University company of actors she had intimate proximity with, and they were fed by women. Because of the Jim Crow hardness. So they weren't allowed in actual hotels. And these Black women fed them. They fed them with collards and disciplined by the unwanted parts of the animal to erase their hunger, and spread their beds as if the Howard Theater Company were staying at the Waldorf. And that is Morrison's language, like the way that they treated them as if they were in some of the most luxurious hotels. Perhaps the traumatic inconvenience of segregation situated them to hear a hum of possibility, the food of tomorrow. The experiences preserved their core, their cardia of the next generation. And in a critique of Black women and food in the civil rights movement, Rosalind Bentley delivers the empirical experiences of Black women who fed the activists during Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s time of activism. In 2018, she records Katie Harris, who describes the labor, quote, collard greens, cabbages, neck bones, fried chicken, cornbread, broccoli, potato salad. All these things Miss Harris remembers. Breakfast, she says, quote, it was bacon, grits, sausage, eggs, toast, milk, juice, day in and day out until they were gone, end quote. The ingredients, as Bentley asserts, came from local farms. For example, the Koinonia farm, an integrated commune some 30 miles north, sent homegrown string beans, peaches, peas, and corn, end quote. Food was and is salvific. Waters knows this. And in her reveries of childhood, she does not note the trauma of segregation or poverty that civil rights movement activists endured, or the nagging hunger of present day Americans, which currently inspires her soulful relief effort. She does, however, note that her devoted work to the clearing of food insecurity began with her family's Victory Garden during World War II. Victory Gardens were clearing spaces where families and communities planted sustenance mere feet from their door during times of war. And here we must note the fraught space of history surrounding Victory Gardens. This is the interesting thing, right? Victory Gardens, as we're learning through scholarship, were in some ways a result, a byproduct of literally placing Japanese citizens, American citizens, in internment camps. By March of 1942, our government had seized over 200,000 acres of Japanese farms, which led to one of the great food shortages. And this is why we also saw the result of propaganda from our government encouraging people to grow Victory Gardens. We literally were within a food shortage because we had imprisoned many of the farmers that sustained our food path. And so using this framing, I'm looking at the ways in which Victory Gardens, although they're problematic in their lineage, it serves as a metaphor in the ways in which Morrison talks about the ways Black people are attaching themselves to the land that they were once forced to work, and how literally this became therapeutic for many of them. I'm reaching the end of my time with you, and we have time for Q&A. So I'm gonna pause and shift us. I wanna close with a question. How do we make Tulsa a Victory Garden when you have the landscape of possibility in Greenwood and other areas of the city after the centennial? How do you shun the divisions that occur even when rebuilding, recovering, renewing, as history shows, is possible? Where you see the oppressed oppressing the oppressed, right? Becoming new oppressors, rather. I want to pause here. If you're wondering how slaves were able to migrate to the north based on the North Star, even when it was cloudy, they would search the trees because the north side of the tree is where the moss grows. And so I was able to get some of that footage in parts of Alabama. This is the field of Greenwood after it was burned down. And so I pose this question to you once again: how does this space that we're in the process of rebuilding nationally and even internationally, right, become a space of a metaphorical victory garden, right, that is not tainted by these taxonomies of class and other variations that pollute the effort that we see, even with Blacks coming into the Trail of Tears as slaves, right? Or there being oppression by marginalized people, even oppressing some of the white settlers, right? We know the de-romanticized narrative of even some of the Buffalo soldiers, right? Harming white settlers in a way as an oppressor, okay? So it's always giving that full narrative so that it is not romanticized. And so I wanna end with my last few minutes with the discussion of a victory garden you have here in your backyard at the Philbrook. And I spent some time with the horticulturalists there, just an amazing team. Jack Titnacher and Austin Jobs are some of the gardeners there. And you need to know that literally in 2021, they provided, I think it was 2,200 pounds of food to local Tulsans who are struggling with food insecurity. And you will see that they're there doing the work. This particular squash is from a 1,200-year-old seed. And so you have these things right here in your backyard. And I'm hoping that sort of stirring the waters, that the part of the healing in a victory garden is literally to sort of break that division where you have victory garden and the Philbrook area, but you don't have a community garden in Greenwood area, right? And I know there's some movement around that, but I'm sort of stirring that water to say, what happens if we go back to the space of, right, the core, that center part of communities that has been traumatized and injured, and what could happen with community gardens that lend it to a space of what? Connecting with the earth and healing, providing food and sustenance, particularly in Greenwood. We know that we have the Oasis grocery store, but that is primarily the one store where people can have relief from a food desert. And there are activists now who are eschewing that language because they say to have a food desert is actually socially constructed. And they're naming it food apartheid, that this is really constructed the way that things have been working systemically. I'm gonna end and finally end on this last note, as I know we have a perfect 30 minutes for discussion, and I can leave my email for you as well. One of the things that I love to do, and which I love about Black literature, is that it does not allow you to pander content and does not allow you to pander people, right? I'm using the Shakespearean term for pimp, right? To do this work, you have to connect to the people in the culture. And I spent about 5 hours, well, 4.5 hours speaking with the gardener, speaking with also Melissa, who put me in touch, and she just had this wonderful knowledge. She was even the person at the Philbrook who said, there's a caveat here with the victory gardens. You got to remember this appropriation of our government in this way, in which we literally confiscated land and then replaced it with propaganda of get your victory garden. And so one of the things that these horticulturalists reminded me of was literally scarification of seeds. And when I connected with that concept, I, of course, think of scarification of nations in Africa and what they do literally with scarification of their skin and make designs that distinguish classes, distinguish royalty from commoners. And one of the things that they noted, particularly with the redbud, which is a plant native here to Oklahoma, right, to the eastern region, this sort of eastern region of Oklahoma, is that literally it is a seed that sometimes you literally have to take a fingernail clipper to break it in half in order to scar it. Sometimes they put it even in different forms of acid. Hello, Zoom people. I'm trying not to forget you. In the audience, I wish I could see you. And so they literally have to scar the seed in order to get to it, to plant it in the ground for you and I to have these beautiful red buds, which was one of my absolute favorite things to do, was to drive down 71st and Lewis, and you see that sort of parade of red buds right when they're fiery red before they open and become more purple. And this is a sycamore tree. And so looking at the ways in which nature shows us that some of the most beautiful things come from the deepest wounding. Should we have the wounding? Absolutely not. We should not. But then we must determine what we're going to do. What are we going to do after the wounding? And so I think that Morrison, and if you read Morrison's Oeuvre, trees are everywhere. In fact, on Sepha's back, the scarification, because it becomes keloided, they describe it as a choke cherry tree. And so we get into this dendrology of sorts, right? The study of trees, even in Morrison's Oeuvre. But I want to pause here and just leave that for a space of reflection, and then we can open up with Q&A, however you have designed it, Professor Latham. But thinking of right now where we sit geographically in Tulsa, Oklahoma after the centennial, right? So that things do not become faddish or movement, but they literally become a sustained rewriting of the palimpsest to say, it's not going to happen again. We're going to write it differently this time. And we're going to do our best to demand of our humanity that there are not these taxonomies, right? These hierarchies that say wealthy white people are better than, Black people who are then better than people who are living on Apache and are working class, right? It has to be that balanced yielding of knowledges and people coming to the table. And I know it seems as if we will probably be in a perpetual cycle. But I stand here as a representative of descendants who continually were given no's, no, 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 you do not belong here. And yet we demanded yeses. And so that reimaginative hope stays with me. And so I'm going to leave that with you here in this space of what is your part to produce a victory garden, just mere miles from this campus, mere minute of drive from wherever you are in Midtown or South Tulsa, because you have to write, right? There has to be a different palimpsest layering written than what has been in the past. That's the demand. That's the sovereign demand of this narrative. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Zoom folks.
So I think thank you very much. Let me get to the microphone, actually. Thank you very much, Althea. So I'm going to turn on the chat feature here and stop sharing the screen, I think. So give us just a moment. If those of you who are joining us virtually, we do urge you to put your questions in the chat and we will attend to them here, and I'll try to pass them off, or Althea, you'll be able to look at them here as well. Whichever way we make this a little bit easier to do. Okay, and those of you who are in the audience, we'll happily you'll take questions now for a little bit. I think we're going to try to turn a handheld mic on here real quick, so bear with us while we do a little bit of magic. And while Emily sets that up, are there questions here for Althea? Or comments, yes. Well, I think we can start. I think I would like to hear a little bit more. I mean, I think one of the things that sort of surprising to me about this talk, and even when you and I were first talking about the idea for it, was this connection between Alice Waters and Toni Morrison. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about how these two things came together in your mind, because they actually seem, as you said, even in your talk, really quite far apart initially. And I'll ask you to come to the mic while we do that. You can go ahead and answer here.
So Alice Waters is on this crusade even during the pandemic. And we know there were certain things that were on the rise with the pandemic. We knew that there was addictions that were on the rise, right? We knew that domestic violence had increased by some factor of 30% upwards, right? Because people were home and not working. And so being a little bit more cloistered in their homes, not able to run away from the conflicts that they normally would by work or school. Domestic violence was on the rise, but also greatly food insecurity, right? Because of the food paths, right? Food paths is a term, right? Agricultural term of how that particular plant gets to your table and then what you do to consume it. And so we know that the issues with fuel and production of food, it slowed down because of the virus. So then food prices were met with an inflation, right? And so you saw pantries across the nation exploiting with need. And, you just had that. People were laid off temporarily. And so Waters was even more invigorated during this time, even though her restaurant was shut down. And like I said, it is, a tray share, a very expensive boutique style type restaurant where you're getting like Michelin chef level food, right? If you're a foodie, right? And so she became even more invigorated with her 501c3, her nonprofit organization, which is partnered with these local farmers to make sure that the schools, their lunchrooms, even though the students were not there, that they were still getting meals out to families. And so when you hear her speak of this, she's very calm. Her decibel doesn't really fluctuate very high. But you sense the fury in her quietness. There's a quiet fury of why does starvation exist in this nation of such wealth and education and the various potential. And this came up even when I was having this discussion with Jack Titchener and Austin Jobs, which, by the way, Rachel Keefe, who is the director of the Philbrook, I think she was going to try to attend tonight virtually. One of the things they really explained to me with the 2,200 pounds of food that they give away, right, is that at times there is this resistance to individuals taking the food, even through grocery stores, that are damaged, right? The presentation. And so it's the perception of the food. And there's great irony in that. Where I've been in Western New York, there's a large number of apple orchards. And there's a bit of cruelty. For a while, I could not eat apples out of the grocery store, and I still struggle when I'm in that region. Cornell University has their own orchard where they're serviced by students and professors. And I would literally drive a couple hours just to get a box of apples for a couple weeks, because I learned this factor that a lot of the brown migrant workers that come up from the influx of the South and cross the border into the United States, they're working sometimes for $2 and $3 an hour, and they have a bag where literally there are eggs at the bottom of the bag. And if at the end of their day, their picking has caused an egg to crack, their pay is deducted from. And that is because potentially when you're throwing the apples into the bag, bruising them is going to cause one of the local grocers to not want to give full price. And so it's going to go to the farmer's market where you're getting less value for the orchard farmers. And so when we learn about these ways in which, I saw, I've been guilty of that. You see an apple where it looks like someone's fingernail has pricked it. You're like, oh no, I don't want that. I don't want the bruised fruit. And there have been these studies of fruit that show that sometimes the bruised fruit actually has more nutrients in it. And so this is where we're getting into this space where Waters is really becoming an advocate. She's becoming a baby Suggs preaching.
and Baby Sigs is modeled after Jarena Lee to some degree. Jarena Lee was one of the first Black female evangelists for the AME Church, which was started because Black people were required to stand around a church house and peer into windows at time while white ministers gave their homilies. And she's the first Black female minister that is ordained, and the restrictions were ridiculous. Like her dress had to be a certain point on her neck so that her neck could not show, her wrist could not show. Of course, these body parts on a woman's body would be too tantalizing. And so Morrison maps Baby Sig's character after this woman. And when you're looking at these ways, you're seeing really Waters take up this sort of pulpit against food insecurity in this nation. And the last that she spoke was around November with the Washington Post. She was there giving a talk. And that's when literally I first heard of Alice Waters, even though I'm a foodie. And I was sitting there and thinking Victory Gardens. And I remembered that moment of Toni Morrison talking about these ways of being in America at a time when America was unloving to Black people. And yet Jim Crow forced them to actually get greater love, because they would travel through the South and in their theater troupe. And they would go into these Black women's homes who were domestics during the day, had taken care of white families all day. And at night, they gave a portion of their time still to these young Black students. And she talked about the way that they treated them as if they were in a luxury hotel like the Waldorf. And so I remember that synergy between the two of how Waters describes Victory Gardens and how it inspired her to even do different things as a chef with a very privileged, geographically situated restaurant. And I looked at her as a Baby Sigs, and I looked at her in conversation in those ways of what Morrison is describing in the oeuvre that she has, right? That Black people, whether it was stooping for soil to get nutrients, whether it was, as that passage from Paradise says, right, the food that was given to the entitled. So we know that this Southern cuisine that we now have normalized as Southern cuisine starts in the slave quarters, that they were to butcher the hog and to give the choice parts to masters and mistresses and their families and overseers. And then they were going to take the stomach lining of the pig and make chitterlings, right? That they were going to take that fat and oil the greens, right? So if you go into parts of Louisiana, you go into parts of Alabama, it's nothing. You have to ask, is there pork or is there fat back in this? You go into restaurants and parts of, I ate at a soul food restaurant in Boston. I was 2 blocks from MIT. And, it's like MIT, you're in Cambridge and you're at a soul food restaurant. And they had collard green mousse, y'all. I was like, what? And so they had elevated collard greens to French culinary skill, making it a mousse. Eating in Paris, you're literally getting a lot of elements of slave quarter cuisine that has been elevated. And so Waters, I see her in this way as a cultural mulatto, sort of breaking these boundaries and these walls and advocating with great humility and sensibility. Why are there starving children in America? Right. And so what Morrison then does is adds to that layer of desperation, right? What happens when you see, Black children who are deprived in nuanced ways of education? We know the staggering statistics. And what do we do with that layered notion of when you have food deserts? The food deserts are not in predominantly white neighborhoods. They're in neighborhoods that are predominantly Black and brown. And I know that's an entire hour discussion of the systemic factors. This goes back to how do we build a victory garden metaphorically? Let's go back to, do I have time? Let's go back to 1963 to the Daniel Moynihan report on the Black family. And this was issued by the White House. And so he got a group of sociologists, historians, Black, white, from different various groups, different sexes. and, you know, produces this close to, I think it's 200 pages plus document on Black families. And one of the things he does, and it's very gendered, it's raced in ways that are embarrassing. Yet to Moynihan's credit, after that report, he goes to the government. He says, give me 6,000 postal working jobs for Black men. And this is where we get the very sexist, because a great portion of the document focused on Black women being too strong and intimidating Black men. Never mind the documentation showing that the first hike in single Black female homes was not in the 1920s with peonage and sharecropping, or even the 60s, right? It's literally the 1890s after the Reconstruction, because there are no more slaves to pick cotton and tobacco and rice and corn. So they're throwing Black men into the chain gang for anything. That is like literally the first hike that you see of what we know as the Black male genocide of imprisonment rates being so ridiculously socially constructed. And so the answer from Moynihan and others is like, the Black woman is the problem. No, that is historically inaccurate. The system is the problem. And so he goes and he wants all of these postal jobs because he says having them work and paying taxes is what we want them to do. He's basically doing a 20th century civil rights movement, Wilberforce movement, right? That's what Wilberforce did in UK. They're better off as citizens paying taxes. And so, long story short, the answer is no. No. He goes back and he asks for a lesser portion. No. And so when we look at these factors of food desert, yes, we know that sometimes food deserts are the contribution is that there is a high thievery and theft rate. But when we look at the genealogy of these histories, we know that our generation is 40 years. And so we have systemically put into place this type of brokenness of the core, of the cardia, and we're expecting it to fix itself overnight. This is where the work becomes where you get really compassionate people who are willing to think through tough problems and break down hierarchies and say, no is going to somehow become yes. And you have models of that. You have models of that even in this city. I think even what you're doing right now after the Tulsa race massacre, the centennial, with a focus on Black-owned businesses in 2022, particularly Black entrepreneurship, particularly Black female entrepreneurship, you're triaging the issue, right, as intelligently as possible. And this is not a Robin Hood plan. This is you writing a new palimpsest layer intentionally, which is what Moynihan tried to do, right? And so, because we know that this history, right, of how many Black educated, college educated people were forced to be elevator operators, domestic workers, right? They have the degrees, but the system did not allow them to occupy those spaces. And so what you find then is that if this generation doesn't stop and triage and say, how do we make this, if I can go back to this, how do we make this space? It'll be another decade. The same conversations irritating everybody. Didn't we talk about this 3 years ago? That same palimpsest layering coming back. And so one of the things that I love is that in this novel, in Paradise, right, Morrison situates this novel around an intergenerational conversation between the elders and the new generation, right? To say, what does it mean to live in an all Black town? Do you even need segregation? Is that needed still? All right. And so there's that sort of nexus between Waters and Morrison. And if she were still alive, I'm sure she probably ate there, but if she were still alive, they could sit side by side on a panel and talk about these issues that should not be issues.
Other questions? I see we have some in the chat here, which I need to pull back up. I can find it. Oh, you might have, did we quit on Zoom? Let's see. There we go. Can you comment on Morrison's lifting up the bottom as a most fertile ground for individuals and communities?
Sure. So is it Yalbonzi? Am I saying your name correctly? Yes, Yalbonzi. Are you speaking to the bottom in Morrison's first novel, The Bluest Eye? I'll take a couple approaches to it. Two comes out of Morrison's oeuvre, one comes out of Morrison's oeuvre, and the second comes out of Black feminist theory tradition. And so the first coming out of Toni Morrison's oeuvre, literally, and it's actually not The Bluest Eye, it's Sula, in which there is a description of a town that is segregated. And initially, and this is what we see currently happening in our nations, we just call it something different called gentrification. So initially, Blacks are convinced to dwell in the bottom, which is considered this horrible, horrible section of town to live in. And so the Blacks go there and they develop it. They pull up the rocks in the earth and they do all the things they need to cultivate it. And then the predominantly wealthier white people in the plot literally force the Black people out of the bottom and start building golf courses and these fancy homes. And so you see this sort of migration that happens. This happens in urban development, which we call a white flight, right? So an area that I think there are even some of those caveats now with Greenwood, with all the high rises going up, right? That this space that was primarily owned by Black business people, now you're having high rises being built there. How many of the people who come from that particular region or their families were there for years can afford to dwell in those high rises, right? And so then this migration inherently happens. And so one of the things that Morrison tries to do is to really show these ways in which Black people's lives have been subversive. I can go back to this Yalbonzi even with soul food. So masters did not want the intestines of the pig or the hog. Black folk make it into chitterlings, into sausage, et cetera. And then it becomes something that is actually desired, right? It would be interesting, I'm not in the area of food studies, but somebody who's doing their dissertation might do a study, right, of what takes place in literature and describing the ways in which Black families have these culinary heritages, and then eventually you actually see other people co-opting them and then having restaurants that become famous for this cuisine and this heritage. Am I talking about ownership? No, I'm not. But when I'm talking about this way in which oftentimes when it comes to marginalized communities, sometimes something that authentically begins with them, and that's even a problematic word because things are always contributed in cross-cultural ways, but something that starts in a space then becomes occupied by other people and becomes a territory that's commercialized, commodified, and then the people who've sort of brought it forth lose that sort of position of authority or even any concept of connecting to financial funds from it, right? And then also to think about that, where Morrison is talking about these ways in which there's this sort of movement and then displacement. And in theory, you would call that a dislocation, right? So what happens when people are forcibly dislocated? That comes all the way back to, right, the Tulsa Race Massacre. What happens to when you have a space in town, and secretively we know this through history, that it was desired, but becomes this opportune moment to what? Dislocate the people out and then to occupy it. This is also taking place in Harlem, right? A development that goes bust, right? Those beautiful brownstones were not designed for Black immigrants coming from the South. It was a development that went bust. And so you have all these Black families there for decades. And I can tell you, because I remember taking a class of students there when I was teaching at Towson University in Baltimore. It was 2006, and we were with a docent and of the area and having this tour. And this docent literally wanted to stop us dead in our tracks and say, look, there's Bank of America. I was like, okay, are you going to take us to the first Abyssinian church, like Adam Clayton Powell, like Bank of America? In 2006, that was the first bank in Harlem. And that was right around the time that Bill Clinton had bought his condo. Maya Angelou had bought a condo there. And so these investors saw the trend, right? They saw the bottom moving, Yovansi. And so you can even see that now. When I go through Harlem, parts of it, I'm like, this isn't Harlem. It's become gentrified. And so this is what Morrison is showing positionally and metaphorically of how Blacks go to spaces of impossibility and they scarify it. They break it open and make something beautiful out of it. And then it becomes reoccupied by dominant structures. And so then you also have a Black feminist theory with Patricia Hill Collins, who describes this bottom-up theory, that sometimes the positionality of being at the bottom, even though it would be tough, it is tough. It is a space of being subjected to oppression, that within there is in that space, there's something salvific that allows you to see things differently. So going through a lot of no's in a space of Alabama, right? And I had to visit the 16th Street Baptist Church when I was home. And that was a place that I would go even during high school. You're constantly seeing no's, but that bottom up positionality teaches you to somehow find a yes that people of privilege may not see. And so Morrison is consistently wrapping that around the narratives, fiction and nonfiction, what she does even as an editor for Random House. She talks about having a white male supervisor that was someone who was just contentious and she tried to avoid as best as possible. But she knew that she was there as an apostle of culture. And that's a terminology that comes out of the librarian world, but as an apostle of culture, so that literally we would have Angela Y. Davis's autobiography, we would have Gail Jones, we would have all these people that maybe we would not have had through Random House, but she said, if I don't stay here in this bottom positionality, this bottom up positionality as a steward of these talents and these voices and narratives we need, what will happen? And so that's something consistently that's going on in Morrison's legacy, to be honest. That's a great question.
Well, I think we've hit 8:30, so I hope you'll all join me. Let me get to the microphone so everybody can hear me online too. So we've hit 8:30, so I want to thank all of you who are joining us online for joining us. We'll continue to do these hybrid events. I know there's a slight hitch with some of the images this evening. It's just the hazard sometimes of doing hybrid events like this. So we're grateful to all of you for joining us online. We're grateful to all of you for coming out this evening. And most of all, we're very grateful to Althea for coming back to the University of Tulsa and giving us this wonderful talk. So thank you very much. Thank you.